Today is September 20th, 2017. It is about 12 p.m. This is Luciana Spraker representing the City of Savannah's Research Library and Municipal Archives. I am interviewing Mr. Richard Shinhoster for the City of Savannah's Carver Village History Roundup Days project. We are conducting this interview at the historic Carver Village Community Center. Today we'll be discussing the history of the Carver Village neighborhood and the surrounding community. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Before I get started, did I mispronounce your last name?
You're close enough.
Well, go ahead and tell us what it should be.
Shinhoster.
Okay. All right, well then I would also like you to state your full name.
Okay, it's Willie Richard Shinhoster.
William Richard.
Willie.
Willie? W-I-L-L-I-E.
But usually no one will recognize the Willie. It's usually Richard Shinhoster.
And when were you born?
June 27th, 1942.
And where were you born?
Savannah, Georgia.
Were you born at home, in a church, in a hospital?
At a hospital, and I don't. Georgia Infirmary Hospital. That's the name of the hospital, Georgia Infirmary.
And where did you grow up in Savannah?
Well, for the first 6 years that I lived on Gwinnett Street, West Gwinnett, and what was called Magnolia Street, which is now May Street. There was maybe a block or two of houses, row houses there. I-16 now occupies that area. So for the first 6 years I lived there. When I was ready for the first grade, my parents moved to Carver Village. I grew up from that point in Carver Village.
And before we leave the Magnolia Street house, who lived there at that house with you?
Well, it was my mother, my father, and my sister. It was at that time a family which grew to be 8 people. At that time it was just 4.
And what were your parents' names?
My mother was Nadine Shinhoster, and my father was Willie Shinhoster.
Do you know what Nadine's maiden name was?
Yes, it was Pullen, P-U-L-L-E-N.
Now, when you moved to Carver Village in the first grade, where did you go to first grade?
It was called Springfield Terrace Elementary School. Later, it was
Pearly Smith.
Pearly Smith. Yes, it became Pearly Smith.
Tell me some of your memories of going to school at Springfield Terrace.
Well, it was a small school originally. I think when I started, there were only maybe 4 classrooms, the principal office and a little administrative offices like that. But it was a small school. There were only a few teachers. But as I recall, those teachers were dedicated to learn the children there learning. And for the most part, I believe that most of the children were very interested in learning. It was almost a little competition to make sure to see who would get the best grades. And so we were all challenged, I think, adequately by our teachers and responded well to that. I remember the principal's name because as a first, second grade, I was terrified of the principal. Her name was Miss Harrison. I don't remember her first name, but Miss Harrison. And Miss Harrison would simply walk down the halls and everybody would be quiet and get up there and do what they're supposed to do.
Were all of the teachers female, or were there any male teachers?
There was one male teacher, as I recall. But the majority of the teachers there were female, and the ones I recall or remember were female teachers.
When you went to school, if it was only 4 classrooms, were there only 4 grades?
No, it was 1st through 6th grade, I believe, was elementary. considered at that time. It was an interesting arrangement because at the 6th grade or 7th grade, the teacher had both grade levels. So at that point, we were in classes with both groups. It worked. This teacher, and she really became a mentor of mine, was excellent in handling the upper grades. So we had an opportunity, those who could become more advanced, had an opportunity then to interact with the grade level ahead of them, and it was beneficial. Reading was her specialty, and so it sort of blurred between what was a 6th grade book and a 7th grade book. We learned to read both. So there was, and her name was Marion Duncan. Always remember Mrs. Duncan. At that time, as I approached the 7th grade, I remember reading was not one of my favorite areas. So I didn't do as well. But for whatever the reason, Ms. Duncan just insisted that I develop reading skills. And she also, as I recall, would test us. So testing has always been a part of it. She had the California test, some test, but she would give us that test about 4 times a year and would look at where your weak spots were and what you needed to do to improve it. And so by the time I was finished 7th grade, I read many books, but I think it was because of Mrs. Duncan.
She kept up with you.
Yes, she did. Even after I finished elementary school and went on to middle school, I would still be in touch with Mrs. Duncan. And when my daughter was in elementary school and we wanted to make sure that she had those reading skills down, Miss Duncan became her tutor. And she retired then, and I talked to her. And she just wanted to stay a little active, and she tutored my daughter. My daughter went on to do excellence academic work.
So it sounds too like maybe the teachers were very much a part of the community here.
No question about it. No question about it. Some of the teachers from some schools, there were teachers who actually lived in our community, I think. And I'm not sure if any of my teachers lived in the streets that I lived on and walked through. But there were teachers that lived in the community. I think this was something that helped bind the community together and set expectations for the community. I think our teachers expected us to do well, and they instilled that expectation that there was no reason why we could not do as well as any other child. And they expected that, and I think many of the students responded to that expectation.
When did you eat? Did you have a lunch area?
You're right, there was a cafeteria area. There was milk. I remember little containers of milk, like 5 cents a container. And there would be soup and other little things. I don't remember all the meals, but just like, I guess, children today, you take it or leave it. That was not why you came to school for lunch. But there was lunch. Many children, and I was included in that earlier, brought their own lunch. And so during lunch period, some people would buy the lunch at the school, and others would bring their lunches, and then still all sit together and have lunch.
Was there a playground at the school?
Yes, there was a playground, and that became a place for the community. Of course, there was the recess period, but after school, many of the children stayed and had activities on the playground. We had baseball teams and basketball teams, and all of this was done on the playground. The city provided a playground director, I think that was their title. And this person coordinated the playground. We had basketballs, we had footballs, baseballs, and that kind of thing that was provided. As far as I can remember, by the city, we used to provide those things.
So you mentioned some sports, and you brought some photographs today of some teams. Can you tell us about the teams?
Yes. This was one of the things I believe that caused our community to not experience juvenile delinquency. I think there were virtually no juvenile delinquencies. We had some kids who always acted up. They were natural. That was I think a natural phenomenon for you to have a few kids who would act up. But I think for the most part, virtually no juvenile delinquency. I think it was because of all the sports teams and the after-school activities. This picture that I have here was the winning, and I believe this was baseball. It was the winning baseball team. Carver Village, if you knew much about Carver Village, you realize that Carver Village was, during this era, I'm talking the 50s, middle 50s, late 50s, was basically separated from the rest of Savannah. We were considered to be rural students because we were separated, I think, from the more urban part of Savannah. But we didn't have some of the benefits that some of the kids who live in the city. Like, we have a team. If you look at our picture, we have on just our regular clothes. And when we played sports, we wore just regular clothes, whatever we wore, we had. And so the other teams considered us to be a raggedy team, the Raggedy Nine, which was baseball. But so we took a great deal of pride in beating those city kids, as they were called, who had uniforms. And we were sort of heroes in our school because we did represent Carver Village.
Let's talk about this picture a little bit. So, what's the name? What did you call your team?
As far as I can remember, it was just the Carver Village baseball team or whatever. I don't recall a catchy name like the Paladins. These teams they have out here now. I don't remember.
And you're holding a trophy.
Yes, this was a city trophy because we were first place in our city athletic league, and we won first place.
Do you remember about when that was awarded?
I was thinking about that, and just looking at us, this would have had to be somewhere about 1955 to 58, somewhere in that time period. Don't recall exactly.
Okay.
Just looking at our ages, the age that we were.
And where would you play baseball, over by the school or somewhere else out here?
Well, there we played by the school, but a lot of the games were played on Cannon Park. Cannon Park is a city park near Beach, what's now where's Beach High School, 45th Street, 45th and Hardin Street, I believe. Somewhere there, there's a park there, about a 2-block park. And we played ball there when we were not playing in our own schoolyard.
Do you have another team to show us?
Well, yes. Now the second team, and someone gave me this picture. These were younger. This was a team that came up probably 10 years after our team. So the traditions continued. And this lady, Ms. Harrison, which is on this picture when I came along, is on this picture also. This was my youngest brother. This was Earl Shinhoster, which I know you have heard the name. And so this is when they were a little younger than we were. But if you notice now they have uniforms. I mean, we have gained recognition for Carver Village. It's no longer just a little rural area out here. These kids that came along by that time were able to encourage businesses to help them provide them with uniforms. And as I recall, they became champions also. So for many years, Carver Village, because of the school here, by that time it was Pearl Smith School. And, but the tradition continued. There was still very little juvenile delinquency. I think I mentioned that the second time because I'm very saddened sometimes when I come to Carver Village and I hear stories of some of the crime problems. Besides the neighborhood guy who would get drunk on Saturday night, there were probably virtually no problems. I can recall growing up in Carver Village and finishing high school and going off to college. And one day I asked my dad, I said, can I have a key to the front door? He said, well, I have to find one. I said, well, we don't have one. We never lock the front door. We never need to lock up the house. And because there's no one to come into anybody else's house that lives with me. Everybody knew everybody. Everybody had about the same wealth as everybody else. So of course, there's always it was always levels of income, but everybody lived together. Everybody was friends. Everybody, if you needed a cup of sugar, you went next door and got it. That's the kind of neighborhood you grew up in. So there was not this need, and now not only do we lock our doors, we have alarm systems. And now we have cell phones that will monitor who's in their yard. I mean, that time everybody played in everybody's yard. So I think this is where the kind of Carver Village that I grew up in. I felt very, very fortunate to grow up in that neighborhood.
Do you remember what your address was?
Yes, I always remember. It was 21 Butler Street. Butler Street, the name of the street changed sometime after I'd finished college, or was in college, when the name of the street changed to Barton Street. I never fully understood or appreciated why it was necessary to change the name of our street. It was, of course, it was a city decision, and for whatever reason, the city decided to change the name of the street to Barton Street. When I grew up, it was Butler Street, yes.
You mentioned your parents a little bit. What were their names?
Nadine and Willie.
That's right, we spoke about that. What did they do? How did they help support their family?
Well, my father was a foundry worker. He worked at one of the local foundries. And my mother, who raised 6 children, for her early years, she basically took care of the family, the housewife, and took care of the family. She did have a certificate in beauty culture. They call it beauty culture, cosmetology degree. And so she, and in the home, she had a little beauty culture business.
Do you know where she got that certificate?
Yes. Madam Carver was, I believe, the name of it. You evidently you've heard that name?
Well, I haven't heard that name, but we also have a lot of photographs for Bertie Friedman in her beauty school, so I was curious if there was a connection.
That I don't know, but she had her license through the Madam Carver Beauty Culture School. And so she helps augment the income by taking care of the hair needs of the people in the neighborhood. And then with my father. So they were the kind of parents who understood that part of their responsibility in life was to raise good children. And whether they had all of the conveniences in life or not, they expected the children to be good children, educated children, with a good moral standards and values. So all 6 of their children finished high school, college graduates, and gone on to do other things.
What were some of the other important leaders that were in the neighborhood?
Well, during this time, if you recall, Carver Village was probably one of the first developed subdivisions, using that terminology, for African Americans in the country, and as homeowners. So as African Americans began to afford better accommodations, Carver Village was one of the stopping places from strictly rental properties that the urban people had. I can recall when I was in first grade, my father, when we moved to Carver Village, he bought the house. And all of the other people that lived on our street owned or were buying the property, and so such was Carver Village. Even though there might have been smaller homes, there was a certain amount of pride, I think, in the fact that these people were owning this property. And so you would have school teachers, you had people who worked for the post office, and all this kind of, you have a mixture of people from different economic standings living in the same community. Therefore, we had some African Americans who were professionals, using the vernacular that we would use today, that lived right next to people who were common laborers. And so there were many people then that were examples and role models that we had to look at because they were able to acquire more education and better jobs.
Let me ask you a few questions about your father, Willie. Was he originally from Savannah?
No, he was from Campbell County, Better, Georgia. My grandfather was a farmer. His dad was a farmer, and so he lived there in a little community called Pulaski, Georgia, in Campbell County. And when he finished high school there, he came to Savannah State, which was Georgia State University at that time. Since he started his family, he did not continue. He did not graduate. I think that's the reason he came to Savannah.
And he worked at a foundry. Do you know what he did?
It was a foundry that poured steel. Because I can remember sometimes he would come home and if you could just imagine, if you're pouring steel, it will spatter. He would have these little places on his leg where hot steel would hit the leg. They were boots, but sometimes it might slip through. So it was a job that was a tough job. And we often have to thank him for sticking with that job, because this was what he used to pay for his house and raise his children.
Was that the first piece of property he owned himself?
Yes.
During World War II, did he serve in the military?
No, he did not serve in the military.
We don't get to talk to many people from that generation, so I want to get for as much as I can about him.
Yes.
And was your mother a native Savannah?
No, she was also from Campbell County, and went to school there and finished school, high school. So both of them were high school graduates, and came to Savannah to go to the cosmetology school.
Did your father walk or drive to work?
For many years, he walked to work. And then later, he was able to buy a car so he could drive. But as I recall, rain and cold did not stop him from going to work. He went to work. My dad went to work every day.
Can you tell me about some of the specific churches or community resources that supported this area?
There were a few churches, and I don't recall the names, but during this time that I grew up, Carver Village consisted of Bowden Street, Carter Street, Crosby Street, Covey Street, Lyman Street, which was across from, that's another significant thing. We say Carver Village, but I didn't actually grow up in what's the houses that are considered to be Carver Village. Between Gwinnett Street and what is now I-16 was basically Carver Village. Gwinnett Street over to Conwall was considered the waterworks. If you can just imagine the arena coming into that's a brick building there, that was considered the waterworks building there at Stiles and Gwinnett. Well, between Gwinnett and Conwall Street was several streets that went all the way, that started at Stiles Avenue and came back to here, by where we are now. And we lived in that area, so it was considered the waterworks, but everyone just considered everything Carver Village there.
So if somebody asked you where you lived, you would say?
Carver Village. Carver.
What other little neighborhood pockets like waterworks were there?
Well, as you proceeded, there were since Carver Village started in Bowden Street. That was the first paved street. Of course, when Carver Village was built, even though the streets were narrow, they were paved. That was a significant thing for African American developments, that the streets were paved. Gwinnett Street was not paved. So the bus system, and there was a bus system at that time, would come from West Broad Street down Gwinnett Street and stop at Stiles Avenue, because that was the end of the paved area. And later, the bus came into Carver Village, but originally that was where you had to walk up to Stiles Avenue to catch the bus, just to go to West Broad Street, which was called that time. And it seemed like that was such a long place to go. We would have to walk that distance.
That's like going to town.
Exactly. When we did that, we were going to town.
And when you went, why would you go to town?
Well, that's where most of the shopping was. West Broad Street at that time, which is now, of course, Martin Luther King Boulevard, was where you had most of your retail stores, grocery, as well as clothing stores, lots of clothing stores. And any of the other activities that you needed to identify with going to town was on West Broad Street. So that was a reason for going there.
So when you were growing up in a segregated Savannah. Mm-hmm. Did you realize that?
Well, of course we realized that we were treated differently. Everyone who lived in this area looked just like us. Plus, when we moved into Carver Village, there were whites that lived in Carver Village, and they were leaving. And this made, well, actually not in Carver Village, because Carver Village was built for African American, but in the waterworks, white people lived in that area. And as they moved out, blacks moved in. So we knew, of course, that there was a difference between black and white. Now, whether that had the influence on us that would have said that made us different, made us inferior, I think because of our school and our parents and our teachers and the fact that they own their property like others, it gives a sense of pride, I believe, that, hey, we needed to do what we needed to do. but of course racism was always there, especially when you went to town. Out here, it was not as much to deal with. Occasionally, white police officers would come out, and we would say they harassed us as far as I'm concerned, because they would say, well, you can't gather on the corner. So no one here but us, we just not ready to go home. They still would say, you can't gather here, get out of the corner. And so we would leave until they left, and then we would go back. And so we figured, we knew then, of course, that was just racist police officers who had nothing better to do than harass young black kids who weren't doing a thing wrong, because there was no juvenile delinquency out here.
So you bring up police officers. In the late 1940s is when Savannah got the first 9 black police officers. Did you ever see African American police officers at that time patrolling or walking a beat in your neighborhood?
No.
Just white?
No. And the whites didn't walk the beat, they drove cars. They would just drive through quickly, and that was it. Most of the black police officers at that time patrolled the inner city areas, West Broad Street, East Broad Street, and between that.
With the urban renewal in the 1960s and 70s and the massive changes on West Broad Street, did that filter back towards Carver Village at all? Did that have an impact on this community?
I think so. And the reason I believe that's probably when we would begin to see changes, because transportation routes allow people to move back and forth much easier. And Carver Village was no longer that place that was considered out in the rural area. I think urban renewal brought it into full focus with the city. And as a result, I think that had an impact. There were, and I was driving here today, I hadn't seen these signs that I paid any attention to in a long time. On Gwinnett between Bowden and Carter Street, there's still a sign that says Irvin's Supermarket. So there are 3 or 4 little markets out here, blacks owned, and made a living as black business people. I think that opened that up, and integration, of course, followed soon after that, and that saw the demise of these little small black businesses that actually operated here. So I think, yes, that did have an effect.
I noticed on the picture of the younger baseball players, they're wearing jerseys that say Hagen's Market. Was that a local store?
No, Hagen's Market was, I believe Montgomery Street, but it was not out. It was not in this one of the stores here.
And just while we're still talking about children, other than sports, what did a child do for fun out here? What did you do for fun?
Well, sports took up a lot of time. You had to practice, and then you had to go play games. But there were other children, of course, that did not do those things. There was a couple of churches out here, and people did go to church. There were other kinds of social activities that went on. I can recall during special times we would have parties, and there would be dancing and those kinds of things. The school still was one of the centers, because I think that the school planned activities, and there were little activities. So there was a social aspect to it. I can recall about growing up out here in junior high school. I had we always wanted to have our own means. There were 6 of us in the family, and so I began to sell newspapers. I had a newspaper route. I sold the Tribune, which is still in existence today. I sold that paper, And the Chicago Defender, they would send it in and I would sell those. So during my middle school years, I had a little paper route, Friday and Saturday. I did that. Many of the other young people did those kind of things also. So many of the young men especially had little jobs.
Any other favorite memories or things you want to share with us about what makes Carver Village special?
Well, I think that I've highlighted the fact that Carver Village consisted of homeowners for the most part. People were struggling to buy their own homes. And I think that whole sense of economic sustainability transcended through the neighborhood, and all of the people that lived here then took pride in their property and in their homes. Their children were special to them. Many of the women did not have full-time jobs. Some because they were not available, except they were housekeepers and maids, and I think there was a certain amount of interest in not doing that kind of work. And so they raised children, and the PTA was something that people looked forward to interacting with. The school was important, and so as much as they could, they supported the school.
Can you comment at all about Pearlie Smith, or who the school was renamed?
At the time, I did not know who Pearlie Smith was. At the time they named the school that. So I did not know her personally. Yeah, so I didn't know her personally.
Hey, young man.
Hey, my friend, how you doing? Good stuff.
Good to see you.
Good to see you too. All right now.
Well, we're just about done. I did want to take this opportunity while I have you here captive to ask you if you had any thoughts you might share with us on WW Law.
Well, WW Law, growing up, I guess I got to know him better at high school. I didn't know about it during elementary school at that time, because if you recall, WW Law became president of the NAACP. I must have been.
It's 1950.
Yes, I was. 1950. So at that time, I was a student, I think, in College Junior High School. It was called College Junior High School at that time. It's where the EOA building is. And he would, he was the kind of person that you wanted to hear what he had to say. However, he was the kind of person that you were almost intimidated by as a young person. But we all respected WW Law. And when he became president of the NAACP, I think we began to, you asked about segregation, integration, and that kind of thing. I think he became the champion for African Americans in Savannah, became that voice as we emerged more into the mainstream of Savannah and began to understand more that this was a segregated community, there was bigotry and hatred in this community, and now you had to deal with it. Living in Carver Village, and you were more isolated from that because you had your own community. But once we opened up and urban renewal came, he became the leader. And WW Law understood the larger picture. Both of my brothers were influenced by, younger brothers were influenced by WW Law. My middle brother, George, really became one of the first people to integrate the schools here. He was one of the ones who integrated Rose High School, and this was directly because of WW Law. Trying to find students who had the mentality and the academic potential to withstand the abuse that they were going to withstand. He understood, even I think, more than the parents did. but also had the academic ability to compete with white kids. I think that was something that W.W. Law, I think, doesn't get credit for. He handpicked the students. And then my youngest brother came along. Earl was mentored by W.W. Law and formed the first youth council. So our family had this relationship with W.W. Law through more of my younger brothers than myself. But I would go to places where he was speaking or where he was going to be talking and doing the demonstrations. Of course, he always emphasized the nonviolent practices. And so we had to listen to what he had to say about how do you interact when you go out to do your civil disobedience activities.
Well, those were the questions I had today, so just leave it with the last question of anything else you want to make sure we know.
Well, I came here because I want this word to go forth, that Carver Village is a place that at one point influenced Black life in Savannah. And I'd like to see that, I'd like for Congress to return to that. I think Reverend Ellis is interested in doing that, so I wanted to support him. In fact, Reverend Ellis lives across the street from where I grew up. He built a house there, and it's exactly directly across the street from where we grew. So I knew, while he didn't grow up necessarily in Carver Village at that time, that I came along, his wife's family did. And I always remember his wife's grandmother, Miss Bryant. And Miss Bryant was the sort of the neighborhood grandmother. And behind her back, we call her the White Eye. The White Eye is a person who would see everything in the neighborhood. And she would, when your parents come home, if you've done anything, they would, oh, you get it, because Brian would report on everybody in the neighborhood. And people took care of each other like that. And whether we agreed with what Mr. Bryant reported or not, if Mr. Bryant said it, that was it. Yeah. So.
Anything you want to add?
Sorry, yes.
All right.
Okay.
I want to thank you very much for sharing your
Okay, and I appreciate what you've done, and you've all